They were adored by millions, worshipped on stage and screen, and behind the curtain, absolute nightmares. This isn't fame at its finest. It's charm weaponized, egos unchained, and reputations that aged like spilled brandy. From cutting wit to quiet cruelty, these 13 British legends left more bruises off camera than on. So pour a drink, lower your expectations, and meet the stars who made audiences swoon and coworkers suffer. This is 13 old British stars who were biggest douchebags in real life. You've seen their performances. Now, let's see the mess they left behind. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed, especially if you love your nostalgia shaken with a little scandal. And hey, while you're here, where are you watching from? And what time is it? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? Let us know in the comments. We're guessing this isn't your average afternoon viewing. 1. Rex Harrison. In the golden age of British prestige cinema, Rex Harrison didn't just play upper-crust snobs. He practically invented the archetype. Audiences loved him for his clipped diction, aristocratic arrogance, and that peculiarly English air of being mildly disgusted by everyone in the room. But unlike most actors, Harrison didn't leave the character on the set. He carried it around like a tailored overcoat, buttoned up with disdain. Those who worked with him rarely forgot it. Directors described him as deliciously difficult, though few actually meant it deliciously. Collaborators spoke of a man who delivered charm with the warmth of a scalpel, all gleaming wit, no empathy. The pattern was classic. He'd size you up, slice you down, and maybe, decide you were worth tolerating later. On My Fair Lady, younger colleagues reportedly spent their first weeks dodging his contempt like errant props. His verbal put-downs were framed as clever, but you got the sense the laughs he got were mostly from people who had to keep their jobs. Of course, mid-century film culture had a soft spot for monsters in cravats. When a man was bankable, difficultness became an aesthetic. Perfectionism, they called it, which is what you name bullying when the box office returns are good. Studios and crews bent around him, like expensive furniture moved to accommodate a guest who never said thank you. Harrison's tantrums were translated into terms like temperament, and the hierarchy protected him. There's no dramatic comeuppance in this story. No final set meltdown, no crew revolt, no posthumous apology tour. Rex Harrison's legacy is intact, lacquered in nostalgia, his name safely etched in theater marquees and Hollywood lore. But ask the people who shared a rehearsal space, and the adjectives get colder. Cutting, arrogant, master of the elegant put-down, an actor who seemed to enjoy you more once he'd broken you in. It's fitting that his most iconic role was a man teaching a woman how to speak properly. Not listening, just dictating. The irony writes itself. But if you thought Harrison had a flair for elegant cruelty, wait until we talk about the man who could be 5 different characters in one film, and still make you wish none of them showed up to set. 2. Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers had a face like a mirror. He could reflect anyone, play anything, vanish into voices, and vanish just as easily into personas. He was a genius, yes, and like many geniuses in show business, he weaponized that genius to get away with a staggering amount of nastiness. On screen, Sellers was chameleonic. Dr. Strangelove, the Pink Panther, being there. His performances were so layered, so uncanny, that people assumed there must be deep wells of humanity underneath. Off-screen, those who got close enough described something else. A man who could be magnetic one moment and vicious the next. Not moody, not complicated, cruel, plain and sharp. His professional volatility was notorious. Directors dreaded the version of Sellers who might show up, charming, checked out, or catastrophically combative. Crew members told stories of on-set rages, last-minute walk-offs, and mind games that bordered on psychological warfare. One famous account, after Sellers, had a heart scare. Had director Billy Wilder sneer, "You have to have a heart before you can have an attack." It wasn't a joke. It was an obituary with a punchline. The damage didn't stop at the workplace. Sellers' personal relationships read like a demolition derby. Former spouses and estranged children painted a picture of a man who mistook emotional proximity for a threat. He burned bridges with such regularity, it's a wonder he didn't take up arson full-time. His outbursts were often followed by grand, manipulative apologies, until the cycle reset. Again and again. Why did no one stop him? Easy. Because he was brilliant. Because he made studios money. Because in the mid-century comedy world, the myth of the tortured clown was marketable, even when that clown was doing the torturing. When Sellers hurt people, the story became part of his mystique. Difficult genius was a costume he wore just as easily as a fake mustache. And if you're wondering whether it all caught up to him, the answer is no, not really. He died a respected legend, loved by audiences, feared by nearly everyone else. But Sellers wasn't the only one who made disaster his brand. The next man didn't need disguises. He showed you exactly who he was. Fists, scars, bar tabs, and all. 2 legends down, 11 to go. And it only gets messier from here. If you're enjoying the ride so far, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's next. And while you're at it, tell us, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it? Because if you're listening to scandalous star behavior at 2 a.m., you're our kind of people. 3. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed was not a man who misled anyone. He arrived exactly as advertised. Loud, unpredictable, and wearing the smirk of someone who found your discomfort amusing. There was no pretense of manners or mystery. You got the brawling, bragging, whiskey-drenched version of masculinity, and if that made things inconvenient for the rest of the cast or crew, well, that sounded like their problem. In an era of well-tailored leading men, Reed was a walking bar brawl. By the late 60s, his reputation wasn't just colorful, it was dangerous. The stories weren't whispered rumors. They were headlines, scars, police reports. He once needed more than 60 stitches after a pub fight. Another time, he reportedly showed up to set so intoxicated he confused a prop wall for a rival. Sometimes the chaos was real. Sometimes it was performance. Reed knew that producers expected him to act like a devil, and he was more than happy to deliver. But off-screen antics are only half the tale. On set, Reed could be bullying, aggressive, and domineering. He had a taste for intimidation, particularly when he felt challenged. Women, young actors, crew members, no one was immune. Some claimed he softened over time. Others quietly hoped he'd just forget they were there. There are reports of misogynistic tirades and deliberate provocations on talk shows. A circus act, yes, but one that left bruises on everyone else involved. Reed's defenders, and there are still many, often paint him as a misunderstood rebel. A man allergic to pretension. A throwback to an older kind of male anti-hero when behavior could be explained away with phrases like roguish charm or pub legend. But this isn't charm we're talking about. It's mayhem, sold in a handsome package with enough talent to keep the consequences at bay. And did the consequences ever really arrive? Reed kept working, he kept drinking, he kept pushing boundaries until one finally pushed back. But that's a story for another day. Because while Reed was burning through sets and bar stools, another titan of British stage and screen was quietly unraveling, not with fists, but with bottle after bottle, line after forgotten line. Enter Richard Burton. 4. Richard Burton. Richard Burton had the kind of voice that could stop time. Deep, rich, and sonorous, it could elevate Shakespeare or sell soap, seduce queens, or read the back of a cereal box. But behind that booming stagecraft was a man slowly sinking under the weight of his own legend, and dragging a few people down with him. His peers called him brilliant, magnetic, tragic. His crewmates and co-stars had other words: erratic, hostile, sometimes impossible. Burton didn't raise hell the way Reed did. He didn't have to. He drank. He sulked. He arrived late, slurred his way through lines, and when the mood struck him, he'd pivot from charm to venom in the time it took to light a cigarette. By the mid-1970s, he was reportedly so saturated with alcohol that on The Klansman, his scenes had to be shot with him either sitting or lying down. He later claimed to have no memory of making the film at all. That's not artistic immersion, that's workplace collapse. Burton's defenders, and yes, their legion, will tell you he was a man haunted by demons. The pressures of fame, the hangover of working-class guilt, the tragedy of being too smart to believe his own celebrity. But none of that excuses the coldness that colleagues described. There were brutal tongue lashings, monologues of self-pity delivered between takes, and more than one account of him actively sabotaging co-stars when he felt threatened. And yet, the industry enabled him. Because Burton wasn't just another actor, he was a box office draw. He was Burton, half of Burton and Taylor, the walking tabloid soap opera. The louder the personal chaos got, the more audiences showed up to watch. His volatility wasn't cleaned up. It was woven into the narrative. Alcoholism became part of the tortured genius mythos. The cruelty, the tantrums, the unpredictable moods, all chalked up to being too deep, too intense, too Welsh. But when someone derails a shoot or crushes a co-star's spirit, depth is a poor excuse. Still, Burton never punched through the furniture or flipped over dinner tables. For that kind of debauchery, romanticized and rampaging, we'd have to look at his drinking partner, co-conspirator, and fellow hellraiser. You know the one. The blue-eyed lion with a death wish and a laugh that belonged to the gods. Peter O'Toole is waiting. 5. Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole walked through life like a man who knew the rules didn't apply to him, and was usually right. Tall, impossibly charismatic, with a voice that could make a traffic violation sound like Shakespeare, he played kings, prophets, and rogues with equal flair. But O'Toole's greatest role may have been himself, the last of the gentleman hellraisers, beloved by interviewers, feared by producers, and only occasionally tolerated by everyone else. By his own telling, and he told it often, his life was a high-wire act of brilliance and bedlam. The stories blur fact and fiction. The time he allegedly rode a camel into a pub, the time he forgot which country he was filming in, the long afternoons that turned into longer nights that ended with someone else picking up the tab and the damage. Whether he was embellishing or not, few people ever stopped to check. O'Toole had the kind of presence that made disbelief feel rude. Unlike his friend and drinking comrade Richard Burton, O'Toole wasn't just fueled by alcohol. He was practically composed of it. His colleagues recounted epic benders and manic rehearsals, jokes that went on for hours, and an appetite for chaos that left sets in a state of barely contained confusion. But the wildness wasn't always fun. He could be erratic, difficult, even cruel in the way that brilliant people sometimes are when they think no one else in the room matters. And that wasn't just folklore. It was workplace reality. Still, no one dared stop him. Directors sighed, crews adapted, and everyone told themselves it was worth it for the performance. After all, when he was on, he was on. O'Toole had a way of dominating a scene without breaking a sweat, which is fortunate because by many accounts, he wasn't particularly fond of rehearsing. His later years mellowed him somewhat, or at least that's what the interviews suggested. But by then, the damage, professional and personal, had already been absorbed by those around him. O'Toole got the applause, everyone else got the cleanup, but O'Toole's chaos came with a twinkle. What happens when the damage comes in a perfectly tailored tux, with a raised eyebrow and a raised fist, and no remorse? It's time to talk about the original 007. 6. Sean Connery. Sean Connery didn't act so much as command attention. He had that rare blend of working-class steel and aristocratic confidence, like a nightclub bouncer who taught himself how to pronounce Chablis. As James Bond, he was everything men wanted to be and everything women were warned about. Suave, dangerous, icy. And, as it turns out, not exactly a model citizen when the camera stopped rolling. Connery's off-screen behavior was always wrapped in a cloud of contradiction. He was fiercely private, but oddly cavalier about saying the quiet parts out loud. In a 1965 Playboy interview, he made comments suggesting it was acceptable to strike a woman under certain conditions. And when asked about it again years later, he didn't backpedal. He doubled down. The outrage came, sure, but so did the applause from those who viewed him as a bastion of old-school masculinity. That word, masculinity, seemed to follow him everywhere, though rarely in a flattering context once you dug deeper. Some of Connery's defenders have insisted he was simply a product of his time, a rough man from a rough background, misread through modern eyes. But time doesn't change the core of a person, just the excuses we use to explain them. Industry accounts often paint him as cold, controlling, and prone to fits of domineering behavior, both on and off set. He was not a man known for second chances or soft landings. His co-stars described him with a mix of admiration and wariness. He brought gravity to every scene, and occasionally a storm cloud. There are stories of clashes, of him pulling rank, of battles over ego dressed up as professionalism. And like many stars of his caliber, Connery rarely had to answer for any of it. Studio heads forgave, audiences forgot, and the box office did all the justifying necessary. He remained a cultural icon long after Bond. He aged into a grandfatherly persona, all wisdom and warmth in interviews. But the shadows didn't disappear. They just wore better suits. And if Connery was the cold front, the next man was the thunderclap. Theater royalty, a national treasure, and reportedly one of the most intimidating egos ever to walk across a soundstage. Enter Sir Laurence Olivier. 7. Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier didn't just act. He declared. He thundered, brooded, and commanded. A knight of the stage long before the monarchy made it official, Olivier was Britain's theatrical royalty. He was Hamlet, Henry V, and Richard III, not just in performance, but seemingly in temperament. For all his technical brilliance, Olivier came wrapped in a force field of ego and entitlement. Not just a great man of the arts, but a man who expected everyone to agree, all the time, on set and in silence. Olivier's genius wasn't in question. His tyranny, however, was another matter. Stories from collaborators painted a picture of a man who could be cutting, condescending, and spectacularly dismissive. He famously despised method acting, which he considered an American indulgence for insecure amateurs. During the filming of The Prince and the Showgirl, which he directed and starred in opposite Marilyn Monroe, Olivier's disdain was practically a second character. He ridiculed Monroe's acting process, her delays, her anxiety, apparently missing the irony that he was the one creating half of it. One quote sums up the dynamic and the damage. When Monroe was struggling with a scene, Olivier is reported to have snapped, "Why don't you just try acting?" It sounds witty, in isolation. In context, it's brutal. It reveals a man who not only lacked patience, but seemed to lack curiosity about different methods, about vulnerability, about anyone else's way of working. He wasn't there to collaborate. He was there to be obeyed. You might call it the actor-manager complex, a relic from a time when stage greats ran their own empires. Olivier embodied that fully. On set, he wasn't just the lead. He was the authority. You didn't direct him, you worked around him. And while some actors revered him, others quietly left productions with nerves frayed and confidence shattered. Was he always like this? Not exactly. Friends noted he could be generous, charming, even self-deprecating. But on the job, the instinct to dominate tended to win. And when things went wrong, his favorite culprit was whoever happened to be closest. But if Olivier was the thundering institution, the next man was something more unpredictable, sharper, snarkier, and quietly corrosive. The wit was quick, the diary was brutal, and the smile never quite reached the eyes. Time to meet Kenneth Williams. 8. Kenneth Williams. Kenneth Williams was a national treasure with a loaded tongue. Best known for his work in the Carry On films and his endless presence on British radio, Williams was campy, clever, and, by his own admission, deeply miserable. He had the voice of a vaudeville angel and the disposition of someone perpetually trapped in a room with people who didn't get the joke. Publicly, he was a one-man comedy machine. Exaggerated expressions, sharp one-liners, and a mastery of double entendre. But behind the scenes, he was reportedly difficult, erratic, and often exhausting to work with. His legendary diaries, thousands of pages long and published after his death, are a chronicle of contempt. For directors, for co-stars, for fans, for himself. If he wasn't irritated, he was likely asleep. The entries swing between self-loathing and seething critique. And while diaries are private by nature, the sheer volume of bile gave the public a clearer picture of how unpleasant it could be to orbit his universe. Co-stars remembered his sulking on set, his stormy moods, and the sense that no one ever quite knew which version of Kenneth Williams would show up. Sometimes he was hilarious. Other times, he was poison in a cravat. He could be devastating with a single line, not in the service of comedy, but as a reflexive form of social violence. People around him often bore the brunt of his insecurities, dressed up as high standards. If you were younger, more confident, or simply too optimistic, chances were good he'd cut you down before lunch. Of course, it wasn't just cruelty. There was sadness, too, and a crushing sense of isolation that likely fueled the bitterness. Williams was a man out of sync with his time, his fame, and possibly himself. But in the workplace, empathy didn't undo the damage. Whether he was undermining colleagues or publicly mocking the very productions that paid his rent, Williams left a trail of burned bridges and probably annotated each one in his diary for dramatic effect. And yet, as prickly as Williams was, he didn't control entire productions. The next man? He did, with a stare that could freeze executives and a vision that no one was allowed to question. Let's talk about Patrick McGoohan. 9. Patrick McGoohan. Patrick McGoohan didn't just star in television, he dominated it. With his piercing gaze, clipped speech, and theatrical intensity, he wasn't merely acting. He was commanding. Best known as the enigmatic number 6 in The Prisoner, McGoohan didn't just lead the show, he was the show. Creator, producer, star, and self-appointed philosophical architect. And if you were in his orbit, you weren't a collaborator. You were a variable in his private chess game. On screen, McGoohan was electric. Off-screen, he was reportedly combative, controlling, and obsessed with ideological purity. The stories that emerged from the making of The Prisoner are less behind-the-scenes fun and more cautionary tales about what happens when creative genius becomes a one-man regime. Crew members described an atmosphere of unease. Scripts rewritten at the last minute. Scenes abruptly canceled. Entire episodes restructured because McGoohan decided the philosophy wasn't tight enough. To be fair, the man had a vision, and a compelling one. He didn't want The Prisoner to be a typical spy caper. He wanted it to be an existential meditation on identity, surveillance, and resistance. But the process of making it? Often chaos. Writers were routinely dismissed. Directors found themselves overridden. Even actors found out what their characters were doing halfway through filming, assuming the script hadn't changed again. One production manager likened working with him to being trapped in a village of his own making, which poetically was exactly the plot. It wasn't just the show. McGoohan's perfectionism followed him across his career. From guest roles in Columbo to film appearances, he earned a reputation as difficult, a term that often means won't let the studio win. But in his case, it also meant colleagues braced themselves for a clash. He could be brilliant, yes, but he could also be brutal about it. Still, to many, McGoohan remains a hero of uncompromising television, a man who refused to dilute his vision, even if that meant alienating half the crew. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to make statements. And speaking of alienation, our next entry wasn't known for rants or rewrites. just a slow, cold burn of disdain. He hated the franchise that made him rich and treated fans like they were asking him to perform at a children's party. Enter Alec Guinness. 10. Alec Guinness. Alec Guinness had the kind of gravitas that made everything feel important, even when it wasn't. His presence could turn comedy into philosophy, turn a stiff uniform into something tragic. He was the high priest of British restraint, the quiet storm. But behind the dignified exterior was a man known for his sharp opinions, deep reservations, and a famously frosty relationship with, well, almost everything he considered beneath him, including Star Wars. Especially Star Wars. Guinness's performance as Obi-Wan Kenobi is legendary. His feelings about it? Legendarily sour. In private letters, he referred to the dialogue as rubbish, the story as juvenile, and the fans as a bewildering species best avoided. One of the most infamous anecdotes involves him allegedly agreeing to give a child an autograph, on the condition that the boy never watched Star Wars again. Some say he was joking, others weren't laughing. But the disdain wasn't just about sci-fi. Guinness carried a reputation for cultural snobbery that bled into his professional demeanor. Directors and co-stars described him as formal to the point of iciness. He didn't shout, he didn't throw tantrums. But he also didn't hide his disappointment if he thought the material was beneath him, and most of it was. This wasn't the flamboyant cruelty of a Reed or the control freakery of a McGoohan. Guinness's version of difficult was a slow drip. He brought the mood down not with fire, but with frost. His sarcasm could flatten a conversation. His indifference could vacuum the energy out of a room. Some actors felt honored to work with him. Others quietly admitted they found it exhausting, like being judged in Latin by a headmaster who never blinked. To be fair, Guinness was a product of a different tradition, one where seriousness meant avoiding anything colorful, commercial, or emotionally available. But that seriousness came with a cost. His relationship with audiences, especially later in life, became increasingly strained. He wanted reverence, not fandom. He preferred being quoted from the bridge on the River Kwai, not asked to say use the force. Still, the public saw robes and wisdom. Only those closer saw the man who loathed the very stardom he helped create. But if Guinness recoiled from attention, the next star ran toward it, high heels and shoulder pads first, and made backstage brawls into primetime ratings. Joan Collins doesn't do subtle. 11. Joan Collins. Joan Collins never pretended to be low maintenance. From the moment she strode into Hollywood in the 1950s with cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, she treated stardom like a contact sport. By the time she became Alexis Carrington on Dynasty, she wasn't just playing a diva. She was method acting one in real time. And if you were on the other side of that confidence, you felt it. Collins has always insisted that what some people call difficult, she calls professional. She wanted the right lighting, the right lines, the right wardrobe, and the right respect. But Dynasty sets were famous for being war zones of egos, and Collins was usually holding the megaphone. Stories from that era are a tangle of feuds, power plays, and thinly veiled insults, all conducted with hairspray and champagne flutes. Some of it was playful, some of it was not. Her most publicized clash was with co-star Linda Evans, the on-screen rival who became the off-screen lightning rod. Interviews decades later still sound like unresolved therapy sessions. Each side convinced the other was the instigator. Collins leaned into the chaos, branding herself as the glamorous villain both in character and out. That persona made her money. It also gave everyone else a headache. But the diva behavior wasn't limited to the soap opera circus. Earlier in her career, Collins was already known for strong-arming producers, reshaping scripts, and refusing to be sidelined. In an industry that expected women to be grateful, she demanded power. That was brave. It was also, at times, abrasive. Colleagues didn't always feel empowered by her assertiveness. Some felt bulldozed by it. The line between strong woman and difficult star has always been unfairly blurry, and Collins has lived inside that contradiction for decades. But even sympathetic accounts admit she could be cutting, calculating, and ruthlessly strategic when her status was on the line. This wasn't someone content to play nice. This was someone determined to win. And she did. She outlasted rivals, outmaneuvered critics, and turned scandal into branding long before social media figured out how to monetize outrage. But that kind of survival leaves casualties. Reputations bruised, relationships burned, sets left tense and exhausted. Still, Collins made it look glamorous. The next woman on our list? Her scandals were less polished, more tabloid splashed, and far harder to control. When Diana Dors entered the spotlight, she brought chaos with her, and the press loved every messy minute of it. 12. Diana Dors. Diana Dors was Britain's answer to Hollywood's bombshells. Blonde, bold, and never quite where anyone expected her to be. In the 1950s, she was marketed as a sex symbol, a siren with a wicked grin and a headline-ready lifestyle. But behind the glossy photos and studio hype was a woman whose real life often felt more like a runaway train than a red carpet stroll. Dors understood the power of scandal better than most of her contemporaries. In an industry that loved to control its stars, she leaned into unpredictability. Parties spilled into newspapers. Affairs became front-page fodder. Every wild story, every outrageous rumor only made her more famous and more difficult to manage. Studios hated it. The public couldn't get enough. But that fame came with consequences. Dors developed a reputation for being unreliable, impulsive, and, at times, recklessly self-sabotaging. There were legal troubles, including a highly publicized theft conviction involving bottles of liquor. Not a career ender, but another crack in the polished image. Producers worried about her. Publicists scrambled to keep up. Directors quietly braced themselves whenever her name appeared on a call sheet. Was she a menace? Not in the aggressive sense of some of the men on this list, but she was disruptive in a way that still rattled the industry. She refused to be neat. She refused to behave. And that made her both fascinating and exhausting. Some colleagues saw a clever woman playing the publicity game. Others saw a star spiraling under the weight of being constantly watched and judged. In later years, Dors became more of a media personality than a movie star, narrating her own chaos with humor and a strange kind of honesty. But the damage had been done. Her early promise had been swallowed by spectacle, and the industry that built her was quick to step back when the mess became inconvenient. Yet even in that mess, she remained unforgettable, a symbol of how fame, when mixed with volatility, can turn a career into a cautionary tale. And speaking of cautionary tales, the final name on our list wasn't loud like Dors or commanding like Collins. He was smooth, elegant, and quietly cutting. A man whose entire persona was built on being a charming cad. George Sanders is waiting in the wings, ready to close the curtain with a smile that never quite reaches the eyes. 13. George Sanders. George Sanders didn't play villains. He was villains, or at least that's how it felt. With that velvet baritone and eyebrows permanently arched in disdain, he made arrogance seem like an art form. Whether he was scheming in All About Eve or suavely narrating his own indifference, Sanders brought to the screen a persona so polished, so drolly heartless, that audiences just assumed it must be autobiographical. And, inconveniently for everyone who knew him, it kind of was. Unlike many actors on this list, Sanders didn't have to fake aloofness. He came by it naturally. Co-stars described him as indifferent at best, actively rude at worst. He had a reputation for being selfish, cynical, and utterly bored by the idea of pretending to care what anyone else thought. Charm was his weapon, but he wielded it like a scalpel, surgically precise, but rarely warm. Directors got what they needed, but not much more. Emotion, enthusiasm, collaboration. Those were someone else's department. He was notoriously lazy on set, often phoning in performances if he thought the script was beneath him. And to be fair, most scripts were. His disdain wasn't loud or theatrical. It was dry and poisonous, the kind of disdain you couldn't quite argue with because it was always delivered with a smile. He was rarely cruel in a showy way. He just didn't think most people, or their work, were worth the effort. The line between role and reality blurred constantly. Sanders once admitted he saw himself as a man who enjoys making others unhappy. And unlike other stars who had PR teams scrambling to clean up after them, Sanders seemed to relish his own bad press. He cultivated his persona like a garden, feeding it with cynicism, watering it with sarcasm, and pruning away anything that might be mistaken for sincerity. Still, he was magnetic. That was the problem. People wanted to believe there was more underneath. A wounded soul, a misunderstood genius, a misanthrope with a heart buried under layers of irony. But most accounts suggest there wasn't. Sanders simply was what he appeared to be. Elegant, brilliant, deeply self-involved, and completely uninterested in changing. His story doesn't end with redemption. There's no tearful reflection, no third-act transformation. Just a man who fit perfectly into a world of shadows and silk, and left behind a trail of sighs, side-eyes, and second-hand anecdotes that still make actors wince. George Sanders didn't just burn bridges. He looked good doing it.